Welcome, everyone. Before we begin our event, we want to take a moment to reflect upon the lands on which we reside. We are coming from many places, and we want to acknowledge the ancestral homelands and traditional territories of the indigenous peoples who have been here. San Diego Mesa College is built on the ancestral homelands of the Kumeyaay people, and we acknowledge and honor their tremendous contributions to our region and thank them for their stewardship, past, present, and future. We also want to honor the legacy of the African diaspora, Black life, and the free enslaved labor upon which this country was built. We acknowledge, protect, and uplift the humanity of our Indigenous and Black sisters and brothers. With this acknowledgement, we want to give honor through our work and continue to stand up for racial and social justice. Thank you, everyone, for coming. My name is Wendy Smith, and I am one of the facilitators for today's event, which is being recorded to share with those who are unable to attend. Please fill out our survey. The link is in the chat. This helps us learn more about our audience and improve what we do. I teach English 101 courses with the theme of ethnography and ethnographic writing. It's more important than ever that students immerse themselves in communities both familiar and unfamiliar. Qualitative research is relevant to life and career, prioritizing lived experience, observational powers, and diverse perspectives. And students bring a lot of that to the table. Today, we are excited to present, I think I have Friday voice or something, and stumbling over words, but it's what I do. It's more important than ever. No, I did that one. Today, we are excited to present our speaker, Dr. Jennifer Sime, a Mesa College anthropology professor who teaches cultural anthropology, anthropology of magic, witchcraft and religion, medical anthropology, and the anthropology of gender and sexuality. She has been conducting ethnographic fieldwork in Spain since 2003. Shall we get started?
Thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen, get this started. Okay, get this going here. All right, there we are. So thank you so much for having me. I'd like to thank Wendy and Katlin for inviting me to speak today. And of course, I always especially want to thank all the students for being here. As Wendy said in her kind introduction, I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I've been carrying out fieldwork in Galicia, which is a region of Spain, for almost 20 years now, which I can scarcely believe. And I know that in Wendy's classes, students are reading and even doing some ethnography. So today I'll be talking a bit about my own ethnographic research. And just as a kind of note for all of us, as a cultural anthropologist, I use the term ethnography to refer both to the process of carrying out fieldwork and also to the process of writing about fieldwork. So sometimes anthropologists will say that they write anthropology, but they also do ethnography when they do fieldwork. And of course, part of this process is also analyzing and interpreting and relating the stories of the people we work with in the field. So today I'm going to be discussing an ethnographic project that I'm currently working on. So it's really, it's rough around the edges. It's about memory, and particularly it's about the memory of brutality during wartime. And I'm gonna give historical specifics about this. And it's a memory about how people resist that brutality. And even more specifically, this project, it's about how people in a particular part of Spain, in Galicia, how they remember and memorialize two women for their acts of resistance against the fascist dictatorship in Spain that lasted from 1939 to about 1975. So I'm going to be talking about how I go about exploring the themes that are shaping my research on the subject. And again, the idea is that you can all see what it looks like to have an anthropological and ethnographic project that's still very much in progress. And just so everybody knows, I do want to give people a heads up. I will be talking about violence today, including a very brief mention of sexual violence. And one of the slides that I will be showing shows human skeletons. So I just wanted everybody to know that ahead of time. So let me see here. Okay. So first, always good to situate ourselves on a map. So on the left, you can see a map of Spain, and you can see the demarcation of the different regions. And in the northwest corner, just north of Portugal, you can see the region of Galicia, which is where I do my work. And on the right, you can see a map where there's a red star indicating the city of Santiago de Compostela, which is the capital of Galicia. And that's where I've been pretty much doing ethnographic work for, a long time now, since 2003. All right, so with that, now that we're situated on a map, what I'd like to do is kind of conjure up a scene for you, in a historical moment. So let us set this scene. This scene is taking place in post-Civil War Spain. So that would be, let's say, in the early 1940s. And it's taking place in this northwestern city of Santiago de Compostela. And it's a very gray city. It's a literally gray city. The skies often have rain clouds overhead. And you can even see on the picture on the right that the streets are paved with granite slabs, very gray city. But people also talk about it as figuratively gray. People talk about the Franco dictatorship in this way, like dull, flat, with the Francoist police force everywhere, and they wore gray uniforms. And so it's gray in this way as well. So we have this gray post-war city. And every day at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, two women, their sisters, they emerge from their home to take a daily stroll. And they are, as the historian and politician Encarna Otero would write many decades later, and she says, I'm going to read this quote. She says, they're as squalid as if they just came out of a concentration camp. They're missing teeth. They're dressed in light and color and uncovered with makeup, as if a representation of them, a mask. Rice powder, blush, red lipstick. So we have these women that are clearly suffering from malnutrition, from the brutality of wartime, and yet they're going out in these extremely bright clothes and just plastered their faces with makeup, right? And they make their way through the narrow streets and these wide plazas of the city center, and they're looking for university students. Santiago has been for hundreds of years a university town, and they flirt with these students, they catcall them students, and then in turn, they are dismissed as reds, or sometimes they're called putas, which is some of you might know is a kind of vulgar Spanish word for like a whore or a bitch. So these two sisters, their names are, as I have on the slide here, Marusha and Coralia Fandiño Vercart. And people in Santiago these days talk about them as colorful, exuberant, defiant, also immersed in their own world of madness. And I'll talk about that more later. And people talk about them as a reminder of both the brutality of the regime in Spain at this time and everyday forms of defiance against the regime. So this is the heart of things. This is what's been kind of driving my imagination and really interested me in this research. And I'm going to talk now about some of the questions that have emerged for me over time that I'm starting to explore. So some of these questions are historical. Who were Marusha and Cordalia? What exactly happened to them? But then there's more questions that I would say are the more anthropological, or we could say ethnographic questions, which are about questions about how people think about them in the present. And that's what are the stories that people tell about them? And what do these stories reveal about people's relationship to the past, specifically the past of the dictatorship? And how do people remember the brutality of that time? And so then there's themes that emerge from these questions about the work of memory in Spain and the links that people make between these women and their flamboyant dress and makeup and apparent madness and acts of defiance. So these are things that that I'm exploring. And next, what I want to do is talk a little bit about then how I explore that, like the methodology, right? Sources and methodology, and this is not a very exhaustive list, but I want to talk about first, and this is what's key. This is what's really typical of ethnographic research and anthropology, what we call participant observation. And when I teach classes in like introduction to cultural anthropology, I always talk about participant observation as the cornerstone of ethnographic research. And by participant observation, I mean the process by which an anthropologist immerses herself deeply in a culture under study. And I often, in an introductory class, I kind of leave it there. But what's actually true in anthropology is that we employ a number of different methodologies. So reviewing primary material on websites, newspaper, fiction. And so I've reviewed material that's been written about these women, looking at YouTube archived videos of memorialization project, documentaries, interviews, especially with feminists in Santiago who are involved in kind of like memorialization projects around these women. And most of the work, some of the work I do is in Spanish language, but Spain is a very multilingual country, and most of the work I do, and some of it you'll see on the slides, is in the Galician language, which is spoken in Galicia, and it's basically a dialect of Portuguese. So this is a project that has a really important historical context that I'd like to turn to now, because it sets the stage for my own research, and it also will make it more, I think, understandable to all of you of kind of what's at stake in this kind of project. So a little bit of a historical overview that I'm going to try to keep as short as I can. So on Spain, on July 18th, 1936, sectors of Spain's military attempted to overthrow the democratically elected government of Spain's Second Republic, which began in 1931. And when they did this, they provoked the outbreak of civil war between Republicans and their supporters and the nationalists and the people who are considered the allies of the nationalists. Republicans definitely doesn't translate to what we think of as Republicans in American society. So Republicans in Spain, this was a leftist government that was supported by labor unions, communists of all sorts, anarchists, the working class, the peasants, the educated middle class. And as the war wore on, they're also supported by the Soviet Union and Mexico. And the nationalists, or in Spanish, the term is nacionales, they consisted of the insurrectionist element of the military, And they were supported by upper classes, the Catholic Church, Spanish fascist militants, and then on their side, as the war wore on, they received material support from Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. And this that civil war lasted from 1936 to 1939. And the war ended when Madrid fell to the nationalists on April 1st in that year, 1939. And at this point, a military dictatorship was installed with the General Francisco Franco as the head of state. And what this slide shows is a rally in Madrid in support of the new government. And you can see the crowds of people making the fascist salute as portraits of Franco are like paraded through the plaza. So the immediate post-war period in Spain was a time when the new dictatorship would take a lot of very punitive measures against the so-called enemies of Spain, those who were on the wrong side of the war by supporting the democratically elected government. And these punitive measures took a number of forms, a lot of social shunning, the rationing of food, and most brutally and notoriously extrajudicial killings, where people who had supported the Second Republic were rounded up, sometimes tortured, and then killed, usually by gunshot, and their bodies were dumped in mass graves. And other supporters of the Republic went into exile. So this dictatorship would last 36 years, from 1975, when Franco died finally of natural causes. And with his death, under immense international pressure, Spain finally began its transition to democracy. And this is where things get a little complicated, but also a little bit interesting. So instead of, in their transition to democracy, instead of looking back at this past of violence and dictatorship and war through like the lens of a truth and reconciliation process, which is something that has happened in other places, such as, just to give one example, like South Africa, Spain chose something called amnesty as a way to kind of forget the past, turn away from the past, and look toward the future. So the amnesty law of 1977 granted amnesty to all of those who had committed atrocities during the war and the dictatorship. What this meant is anyone who had committed any sort of what we might call now a war crime, any kind of atrocity, like rounding up people and killing them and dumping their bodies into mass graves, none of those people would be prosecuted. They would all be granted amnesty, right? And this was a way that Spain had to like kind of try to shut the door on that past and just say, nope, we're all in a democracy now. We're going to march forward toward a happy and stable future. Okay. So this law, the amnesty law of 1977, it's very common now that people refer to it as a pact of silence or a pact of oblivion or forgetting. And it's clear that the politicians who were orchestrating Spain's transition to democracy chose amnesty because they wanted, they thought that would be the best way to kind of move toward peace and stability. But what they were kind of leaving then to one side was any sort of sense of like justice for people. And part of this was because there was a real fear of opening up old wounds and maybe starting another civil war if they looked too closely at the past. But just to that, what happened is that this attempt to kind of just forget the past, the attempt to forget the past of war and dictatorship, in the end, it just didn't work. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. So in a sense, the past, looking toward the past became taboo, but that doesn't mean that it was actually forgotten. And what happened was that as time passed, a generation of Spanish people came of age who hardly remembered the dictatorship, and they no longer had the fear that older generations did when it came to like looking toward the past and attending to these old wounds. People remembered the sites of those old mass graves where bodies had been dumped in the war and early days of the dictatorship. And finally, in the year 2000, so obviously that's a good 25 years after the dictatorship ended, there was a journalist whose name was Emilio Silva, who managed to find the grave of his grandfather who was killed and exhume it, right? Bring up the bodies. And he founded what was called an Association for the Recovery of Historical Memory in the year 2000. And the focus of this organization, which still exists, and there's branches all over Spain, was to bring like ordinary people, family members who lost relatives in the war dictatorship, and bring them together with forensic anthropologists and other experts to exhume the bodies, exhume the dead, and finally give those dead like a dignified burial. But they still had to follow the amnesty law. So the focus was not on bringing anyone to justice. There was no searching for the perpetrators of these crimes. It was just about individually giving families some closure. And in this slide, I just wanted to give you a sense of, which is, I personally never, stop being overwhelmed by the sheer number of mass graves in Spain. Apparently, it's in the world, it's second to Cambodia for just sheer numbers. And you can see on this is on this map that they're everywhere. There's a legend there where it shows the red dots are where there's mass graves where exhumations have begun, and they may or may not have been completed. The green is where there's been no exhumations so far, and then the yellow is where bodies were exhumed, but during the dictatorship, and they were moved to a mausoleum that lies just outside of Madrid, where Franco's body was buried. A place called Valley of the Fallen, which is marked with the blue star in the middle. And usually families did not give permission for those bodies to be dug up and moved, but there they are. So yeah, this is, it really is ubiquitous in Spain. Sometimes you can just be like going down a freeway and there's a side, like a little plaque at the side of the road, like this is the site of a burial place. Or like next to a cemetery in a park. It's really all over the place. So the current government of Spain estimates that approximately 2,600 of these mass graves exist, and they may contain up to about the bodies of about 200,000 people. And the thing with exhumation is that it's a job that is never going to be totally finished. Not all the bodies can be exhumed, and of those who are exhumed, not all of them can be identified. But why I'm spending so much time on this as like kind of important background information is because most anthropologists who do work on memory of the dictatorship in Spain, this is what they're really focused on, the process of exhumation. And indeed, even in kind of like the public realm, it's become kind of emblematic of how people are engaging with the past in Spain. Ethnography always has a little bit of has to have some theoretical frameworks, and I've been talking a lot about, or at least in passing, right, about memory so far. And so I want to, before I get back to Marusha and Coralia, I want to explain just briefly what I mean by memory. And this is very much in a nutshell sort of thing, because there's so much that has been written about memory, so much work that's been done in the processes of memory from the perspective of so many different disciplines. So when I write something like I have on this slide, that Spain is kind of fraught with the work of memory, and that people all over Spain are really concerned with the kind of work of memory. I'm referring to the fact that ever since Franco died in 1975, and the transition to democracy began, ordinary people and politicians have been engaged in analyzing, trying to understand the relationship between the newly democratic Spain and the fascist past of its military dictatorship. And slowly but surely, and we especially see this with the exhumations of the graves, people start to break these taboos of silence, and they began to talk about what happened in the Civil War and the dictatorship. And we could say that in this way, they began not just an individual process of remembering, but a social process of remembering. Now, the thing about memory, we can use kind of archaeological metaphors of excavation to talk about the work of memory. And we could see that like the process of uncovering memory is kind of less like the discovery of some perfectly formed and untouched object than it is, as Sigmund Freud once described it, more like uncovering bit by bit the ruins of a city. And memory work then involves like kind of assembling the traces or fragments of the past. It actually involves, in this sense, imagination and interpretation. How do we put these pieces of the past together? But that's not to say it's imaginative isn't the same as saying that it's totally fictional. It just means that we have to be aware of how the perspective of the present and the concerns of the present are kind of configuring and coloring how we interpret the past. Another point I wanted to make is, as the anthropologist Michael Lambeck has claimed, memory work often makes a claim that carries moral authority about the past, and it's establishing a particular kind of relationship, a moral relationship with the past. And that is certainly the case in Spain, where people feel very strongly that to remember the past is to engage in some kind of moral and ethical task. I think that's really important. So what I want to do in this talk, I'm kind of keeping a eye on the time here. Storytelling is an essential part of the work of memory and the work of justice in a place like Spain, where the process of grappling with the legacies of the dictatorship was really long delayed. And I would say that it's storytelling through the creation of narrative, testimony, even rumor, the revelation of secrets, that people are engaging with the work of memory. And a good part of my ethnographic work consists in collecting these stories and trying to understand them. So here I want to turn back to Marusha and Cordalia. And when it comes to these women, just a few things are known for sure. They were both born in Santiago. Marusha was born in 1898 and Cordalia was born in 1913. There were 13 children in her family, and most of them survived past the age of 5. They came from a very working class family. Their father was a shoemaker and their mother was a seamstress. And during the Second Republic, they were well known in the city. They were fixtures in the city. They took their daily strolls with a third sister named Sara, and they wore really brightly colored clothes that they made at home. The men of the family were members of the CNT, which is the Confederation, the National Labor, which is a major anarchist organization associated with the labor movement in Spain that still very much exists. And after the war, the Civil War broke out in 1936, Marusha and Cordalia's father and brothers, they fled, they ran away. They knew they would be targeted by those who supported the military coup because of their involvement in anarchist politics. And several of these brothers managed to stay in hiding for years. Father was eventually found and tortured and sentenced to prison. So the men fled and the women in the family stayed home. And the women in the family then bore the brunt, especially these two sisters, they bore the brunt of the humiliation and punishment that was carried out by the phalangist or Spanish fascist officials who were attempting to pressure them to reveal the location of the hideout of their male family members. Neighbors bore witness to the random searches of the house carried out day and night. Their heads were shaved in the street. They were forced to drink castor oil in public and lose control of their bowels in the street. They were called, as I mentioned before, Reds, as in communists, and putas. And a lot of people think that it was very likely that they were brought to a small mountain outside of Santiago called Monte Pedroso, and that they were tortured and raped there. So in this new world, right, of military dictatorship and state terror, we're trying to figure out what happened to these women. We're left with these stories of fear, humiliation, and violence that I just recounted. And the sisters themselves have left no testimony, no text or memoir that would explain the time before the dictatorship and their lives during the dictatorship. We just know that the sisters remained hidden in their home, and eventually they emerged to take that daily stroll that I was talking about, wearing colorful clothes, thick layers of makeup, and catcalling students. And in the late 1930s, early 40s, and even later, all of this, the color, the makeup, the catcalling, it wasn't just seen as like scandalous, it was seen as dangerous. And to act like this, people thought they must have gone mad because of how they were treated, right, by these Falangist officers. And it doesn't seem from the standpoint of like the year 2023 that it's such a big deal for women to wear colorful clothes and go out in public and do stuff, but we kind of have to understand the gender norms at this time. See their actions in the context of this quote unquote new gender ideology in Spain. And I'm calling it quote unquote new because it was really a throwback to a much older, more rigid form of expectations of what women should be like. So we can kind of see this emblematized in this magazine for women. This issue was dated May 1939, which was just a month after the war ended. And you can see this blonde woman attending to her blonde child. And here I just want to note that like kind of Nazi-esque Aryan ideals were very much alive and well in Spain at this time. And you have another woman there in the background sending her children off to school to this picture perfect village, and her arm is raised in the fascist salute. So Catholicism was the only recognized religion in Spain during the dictatorship. Accordingly, the Virgin Mary was idealized not only, of course, as the mother of God, but also a model for women. Women were supposed to be maternal, but completely non-sexual and attend to their children and the home. They completely lost the rights that they had gained during the Second Republic. So they were legally considered the dependents of legal male relatives, and they needed a male relative's permission to work, to travel, to open a bank account, etc. They lost the right to vote. Divorce was made illegal. So just in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over one of my slides and kind of jump a little bit. There we go. So what I want to do is jump to the very recent past, in the past 10 years, and the very recent efforts to remember Marusha and Coralia, not as these so-called crazy women who were wandering the streets of Santiago, but as courageous women who in their own way resisted the dictatorship. So there are these public homages to Marusha and Coralia that began to be held in 2011. And the first was held when it was held in 2011, it was meant to do a couple of things. One was to remember women who struggled against fascism, particularly working class women. and focus on their forms of resistance. The homage is always held at a city park. People gather at a statue of Marusha and Coralia. The date that it's held is symbolic. It's held on July 18th, which is the anniversary of the military uprising that began the Civil War. The time of the gathering is symbolic. It starts at 2 p.m., which is the time that Coralia and Marusha would always take their daily stroll. And the slide shows the flyer that was disseminated in social media to advertise the homage. You see a lot of purple in it, which is associated with feminism and feminist movements in Spain. The text underneath that colored photograph reads, it translates to many forms of repression, other models of resistance, and it says that people who attend this homage should bring flowers and wear really colorful makeup and colorful clothes. And so this is a picture I took from the homage in 2017, and this is a little mini excerpt right up from my field notes. So it says here, the sisters were invoked with colors, with flowers, with vivid makeup and clothing. Many of the women present wore artificial flowers in their hair, dresses splashed with floral patterns, tight red dresses, crimson lipstick. They carried flowers, carnations and hydrangeas, mostly in the colors red and violet, that invoked the tricolor flag of the Spain's Second Republic. And then at the end, there was always the call to return year after year, always on July 18th, always at 2 p.m. And everybody clapped when the speaker said, "Down with fascism, down with repression." And here's some more photographs from the homage, and you can see some of the flowers that people were bringing. And I think one of the things that strikes me so much here is that instead of like seeing as like beauty and color and femininity as something like that's just distracting from political activism, they're actually trying to understand these things as a potentially intrinsic to political activism. Like, how do you engage with the past in a way that is kind of exuberant and playful and colorful and do all these things and involve like satire and laughter? I think they're trying to create like a new form of like a political imagination and political resistance to the issues that also exist in the present in Spain. Now I want to turn to just two of the stories, two people who have spoken at these homages and two of the stories that they tell of them. So one is this woman, Lola Ferreiro, and she has said, she's a politician in Santiago, and she has said they adapted to that terrible situation by constructing their own world of colors and flower-covered dresses and kerchiefs decorated with color. Makeup on and let themselves be seen all around Compostela. It's a show of absolutely creative resistance to fascism. And one of the things I just want to emphasize is like, even though they were, and everybody knew that they had been victims of the regime and they were suffering, they made like a spectacle of themselves, like on purpose. They made themselves really visual, really visible. And this flew in the face of what women were supposed to do during this dictatorship. They were supposed to be quiet. They were supposed to be sexless. They were supposed to wear clothes that didn't draw anybody's attention, right? The second story, and this is, I'm going to end with this story. This is from a novelist named Teresa More, who wrote an essay that she presented, the very first homage to Marusha and Coralia. And I find it really moving. And I just translated a couple excerpts here that says, they went out in search of men, and when they found someone, they catcalled, they shouted obscenities and were told "cala puta," which means in Galician, "shut up, bitch." And then she's kind of imagining this scene. They would just laugh deep in their throats. They laughed at those fascists and sons of fascists with their uniforms and combs in their pockets so as to keep their hair nice and smooth, laughed at the insecurity and fear of those fascists and sons of fascists. And then she says, Corelli and Marusha learned what all the defeated know. Once they take away your dignity, they can't do anything else to you. And so 2 o'clock, las duas en punto, is the time of rebellion. And it really has this thing of when they laugh at those people, according to More, they are revealing who those people really are, that they're, underneath the uniforms and the pretty hair, they're cowards who are afraid of anybody who thought differently than they did, who would not hesitate to use brutal forms of violence in order to maintain their, what was otherwise a precarious hold on power. And in a way that laughter is a form of, like, it almost sounds like kind of mad laughter, but it's a way to speak truth to power. And I think she's saying something else. And I think Teresa More is saying that that this laughter unites them with other people in other places who have been brutalized at the hands of the state. And this laughter is kind of also echoing in the time that Teresa More is writing and speaking, when she says that 2 o'clock is not the time of rebellion. And I think what's one of the messages here that I'm really interested in is that there's always this need to rebel against and root out fascist and authoritarian tendencies in society. This is true in Spain. The people I work with in Spain all know this deeply. But this is true elsewhere in Europe. It's true right here in the United States. As we've seen in recent years, the reemergence of right-wing extremist groups, some of which have explicitly fascist ideologies. So this is where I'm kind of going with this. I'm interested in all these people who are interested in trying to bring back the memory of these women from being forgotten. And then so doing, they're trying to tell stories, they attend homages, they bring offerings, and they're trying to, and in a way I feel like we all could learn from, contend with the past, do justice to people who were brutalized in the past, and really try to create new forms of fighting against authoritarianism in all of its forms, both past and present. So I hope I didn't go too long, but that's kind of the general thrust of what I've been thinking about in my research, what I've been working with, and kind of how I've gone about things. So yeah, I'd love to hear anybody's thoughts or questions.
Jennifer, I could listen for hours. I was wondering if anyone here has some questions. You can feel free to shout them out or put them in the chat.
I hope people aren't being shy, because I would be happy to take any questions at all, whether it's about process of doing ethnography or anything else.
I do love that you said ethnographic work is collecting stories and storytelling. I think that's a really good way to put it. Can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, I was thinking, even just talking to some students in my introduction to cultural anthropology class, and talking about how to do an ethnographic interview, like the mark of a good ethnographic interview, and actually it takes time to get this, is that the person the interviewer is speaking as little as possible. And I think that's because in anthropology and in ethnographic work, the focus is on other people and what they're thinking, what their hopes are, what they're imagining. And so we want to hear like their stories are our data in a sense. We want to hear their voices as much as possible, and then work from those stories in order to tease out maybe the meanings, almost as if you would, of course you teach English, but almost as you would with like a literary text. We want people to kind of give us these texts, right, to work with. I think you're muted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I often envision the students who are working on ethnographies like going into their next class and reading a literary text like they did a community, right? With some of those skills of paying attention to what's important and what they can analyze from it.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like we have a question. Thank you, Lance Parker. Is Castellano considered a vestige of oppression in the Galician community?
That's a charged question. It depends who you ask. It depends who you ask. It's not as much as in other places, but there are people who, I mean, everybody in Galicia basically is bilingual, and can at least understand, even if they don't speak Galician very well. I think people who are very politically minded and who might be kind of have sympathies for like the people who want the independence of Galicia. I think they regard Castellano, so that's the name for Spanish that's spoken in Spain, as potentially displacing Galician, because Galicia is always losing Galician speakers, like people who are really fluent or who that's their first language, that's their primary mode of communicating with people. So maybe I wouldn't say oppression so much, but it is seen as a little bit of that Castellano could displace Galician, and has displaced Galician. And of course, the issue with that, as we know in anthropology and outside of anthropology, is that languages, they carry culture and they reflect culture. So when you lose language, there's kind of aspects of knowing the world or being in the world that disappear. Thanks for that question.
Oh, we have some more questions. Let's see. Shall we just start with the first one? I just wanted to clarify the sisters were treated with humiliation and punishment because of their resistance to fascism. It's crazy how brave they were.
Yes, that is correct. And they were also treated with humiliation and punishment because of their family was actually really well known as part of a as like heavily involved in anarchist politics, which was very much anti-fascist. So yes, that is absolutely correct. And yeah, at a time when everybody was basically, people were really scared and everybody was trying to just kind of keep their, for the most part, people were trying to keep their heads down and not get noticed. The fact that they just put themselves out there in this way and everybody knew they were from that anarchist family, it is amazing how brave they were.
Do they consider themselves comunistas?
I think they would consider themselves anarchists, which is different because different in the sense that that anarchists were more interested in I think more than communists, although they were allies. I would say they were allies, but more interested in dismantling the power of the state in general, like not wanting even the communist state, but more have like kind of decentralized power in local communities. But yeah, even though it was the men who were more directly involved in anarchist politics, from what I understand, the women understood themselves to be anarchists as well.
Thank you. I'm going to skip down one question as long as we're on as long as we're in this topic. Judy Sandaya would like to know what was the position of the church on how these women were treated?
I think they were sympathetic with the church was aligned with the fascist government. And so I believe strongly that they looked at these measures that were taken in terms of like the public humiliation and all of this. I think that the church generally approved of these measures. They thought that that people needed to be taught how to, especially women who put them, be taught how to put into, taught their place, basically. And with that, let me just put a kind of a caveat there. This was the case as a church in most of Spain, but most notably in the Basque country. So in the northeastern Spain, there were a lot of priests in that part of Spain who were anti-fascist. But in general, the church was aligned with the fascist government.
Ron Rhino asks, what about La Pasionaria? Wasn't she also from Galicia?
I don't know. I think that's a conversation we might have to have when we get back to Mesa on Monday. I don't know if she was from Galicia or not. So yes, we will. Conversation to be continued.
Yes. And we'll go back to Castellano. Did Franco try to displace non-Castellano languages?
Yes. So they couldn't really control what languages people spoke in their home, but what they did is they prohibited, the government prohibited any public use of non-Castellano languages in the public sphere. So that would be like radio, literature, books, and then later on, for example, television and film. Yeah. So all of those were prohibited. There was a desire to create as much of a unified Castellano, right, like Spanish culture as possible, and try to get rid of any kind of cultural linguistic difference.
Thank you. More questions from anyone? Has Teresa Moray's novel been translated into English?
So what I was quoting from, it was an essay, actually, not
Oh, it's an
a
essay.
novel, but she is a novelist.
Okay.
I don't know if any of her work has been translated into English. I would have to look, but that essay, no, I just translated it myself.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And I was curious about, is there a documentary? It looks like there's a documentary and maybe a fiction film about the two sisters.
There's a documentary film that's in the Galician language. And there's also, I was so excited when I found this last summer when I went to Spain. There's like an absurdist play that was written about them and performed extensively and won a prize in 2016. By a Galician playwright, and right now that's in the process of being translated into Castilian Spanish, Castellano. But yeah, I mean, one of the things about working a lot in the Galician language is not a lot is translated into English as yet. You have that a little bit more with the Spanish language sources.
Okay, I was just curious because I'm very fascinated with them, and they seem like a really great example of what you're talking about, that in their time they weren't really seen as we see them now, and that our cultural memory of them has been interpreted.
Yeah,
Have
I
that
think
about
that's
right?
yeah, I think that's a really good point. People want to use them as this emblem, right, of resistance, and certainly they're inspiring. And at the same time, people say, even these same people who are saying like this, their defiance is amazing, will say, but we know that they had to have gone totally mad, right, to have been treated that way. So it's really interesting because it's really hard to kind of suss out like motivations or intentions. And yes, they are looked at totally differently now that they've become like this emblem of the city now, right? Kind of like like heroines of the city in a way that is obviously completely different. There's a question. I just saw a question on the chat. Is it okay if I answer it?
Sure.
It's Lance Parker. Do modern conservative Spaniards idolize Franco, or is he relegated as a historical villain? I would so love to say that he's relegated as a historical villain, but it's not uncommon for people to say either the like downplay, like, yeah, he was kind of bad sometimes, but he created the tourism industry in Spain, right? So, and that like he was still putting people to death for public dissidents as that point, but he opened Spain up. But there are a lot of people who will say openly that they're nostalgic for the time of the dictatorship, where everything was kind of in its place, so to speak, and people knew their place in society.
I read just the other day some quote from Richard Nixon, and it might have been when Franco died, and he said, "Oh, he was a great man and friend of the U.S." And I was like, "Really? He said that?"
Yeah, well, the US allied themselves with Spain because since Franco was very anti-communist in the 1950s, Spain accepted like economic aid from the US in exchange for the US being able to establish a military base in Spain, which is still
I see.
there. So yes, in the fight against communism,
Yes,
right?
he
That
was a
was
friend. Yes,
yeah,
I see that.
right,
Okay.
right.
We have one last question from Judy Sundayo. Are the women viewed as heroines throughout the rest of Spain as well?
They're not as well known, and I think this is one of the things that I really enjoy about working on this project is I think that they're really although things like the exhumations, this is known throughout Spain, right? But they're becoming a little bit more well known in the rest of Spain, and like through things like that play that I mentioned, right? Which won a national theater award. So bit by bit, their story is coming out, and when it comes out to other people, people do recognize them as heroines, but it's not, I think, as well known as it should be. And that's part of why I want to work on this, because I would love for their story to be just more well known, and for their story to be told in, I think, in the English language. And a lot of the people I work with in Spain, they're really supportive. I feel like they're really supportive of the project, but just because they do want to like disseminate, right, this story.
I think that would be amazing. Well, everyone, our time's up. It is almost 2 o'clock, the time for rebellion. So we've got a lot of work to do. Thank you to all who attended today. Our next ethnographer speaker event is next Wednesday, March 22nd at 4 o'clock with Dr. Darla Cooper, Executive Director of the RP Group. Everyone, please remember to fill out the survey. A link is in the chat. Thank you so much for coming, Jennifer.
Thank you.
This was amazing. Yes. Yes, you've got lots of compliments in the chat, and please add mine to those. Hope everyone has a happy Friday. Goodbye.
Thank you.